You may be rooting for an early spring, but across the South, we're still seeing signs of up to 3 weeks early of spring.
Exactly.
And that's not really good.
It's
not a good thing. Joining us now to explain why is Dr. Theresa Crimmins. She is the director at the USA National Phenology Network. Thank you so much for talking with us this morning. We really appreciate it. So we're already seeing signs of spring. Exactly how far ahead of schedule are we in these places that, you know, some of these blooms are already coming up?
Thanks for having me. So we're starting to see evidence of spring definitely all across the southern states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and all through Georgia. We're also having reports of spring activity all the way up through the Midwest as well, and even in Oregon, Minnesota, New York. In the southern states, it's basically arriving, the leading edge of spring and biological activity is occurring about 10 to 12 days ahead of what we consider average or normal. But it's important to put that into context. In some parts of that region, that's actually pretty anomalous. There's parts of Texas where we don't see spring happen this early more than every 40 years or so. But in a lot of the other parts of the region, it's actually fairly common for it to come 10 to 12 days early. So the plants are resilient, and it's not necessarily indicative of all bad news yet.
So aside from the warm temperatures, what is it about the weather patterns that cause plants to, think it is springtime?
So for a lot of the plants that we're seeing activity taking place in right now, it really is the warm temperatures that's promoting them, that's driving them to leaf out or flower early. There are other cues to leaf out and flowering that other species rely on, things like how many hours of daylight there is or whether they've been exposed to enough chill in the winter. Typically, plants that require those kinds of cues are not necessarily the ones that we see exhibiting really advanced activity like we are with the plants that we're seeing undergo leaf out and flowering early right now.
What are some of the potential ramifications of spring coming too early? You mentioned it wasn't all bad, but certainly every plant can't be happy that, maybe it gets frozen again in a couple weeks.
Sure. So the risk of subsequent frost is one of the biggest concerns, especially for plants that flower before they leaf out. And we see that in a lot of flowering fruit trees, things like peaches and cherries and plums. They flower before they leaf out. And those flower buds are actually really sensitive to frost. And if they get ruined by the frost, that's it. The plants can't put on another round of flower buds. And what that means then is if you don't have flowers, you don't have fruits. And we've had some seasons in recent years where we've had that very thing happen, where the early warmth promoted their flowering ahead of schedule. They got hit by a hard freeze, and then the crops were decimated for the year. Another way that we've seen that kind of impact was back in 2017. We had a really warm spring all across the eastern U.S. And you might recall that the azaleas that are so iconic for the Masters Golf Tournament were past their prime by the time the event took place. And attendees really felt disappointed because they didn't have those beautiful swaths of color like they were used to seeing during that kind of event. And then allergies. The bummer is when you have earlier start to the flowering season, you've got pollen in the air more and usually more of it too.
Yeah, that's like the worst of it.
Yeah,
for sure. So if this trend, though, does continue of spring coming early, what does that mean for our trees and our plants?
We're generally seeing a trend toward earlier starts to the season. The good news is that plants are adaptable within the season. Sometimes they get knocked back, but we are seeing changes to cropping, and plants have flexibility in their ability to respond too. So it's not all bad news.
Right.
If only we could be adaptable to the pollen, right? Well, Dr. Theresa Crimmins, director of the USA National Phenology Network, thank you so much for joining us. And you know what, Lynette, when I was outside this morning, I heard a lot of birds chirping, more so than I have in weeks past. So
I have heard that as well.
Makes me think they're a little confused as well.
Exactly. I was like, what is going on?
That was actually here in Georgia, by the way. So we'll be right back.